So I'm going to continue here on my commentary, Proverbs chapter 20. Now, today is an unfortunate day. I just lost a substantial recording in which I went through verses 20 through 28. It's almost a 4-hour recording, and now I'm debating what to do. I suppose I should be somewhat thankful, although it pains me to say it, that I have a renewed opportunity to go back through these verses. And perhaps since I have gone through them already, the second time through will be quicker. But not quicker in the sense that it is a relief of responsibility, but quicker to come to the conclusions that took me a while to generate prior. But that being said, there is a bit of a lament at the work that has been lost. I believe I left off with verse 19. And so I'm going to start with verse 20 here. Whoso curseth his father or his mother, his lamp shall be put out in obscure darkness. So back into the trenches we go. Now, as frustrating as it was to lose all of that information, as I've said, I'm quite looking forward to getting back into this. Hopefully it will be as fruitful as the first time. So in order to understand this verse, we have to understand what a curse is. In contemporary culture, we call a curse something... Well, let me back up and say, in contemporary culture, I think a curse is becoming more and more watered down. It is a word that is used, if we are to say a curse word, it is a word that is used in semi-private. It can exist within the workplace. It just can't pass certain boundaries. The word itself, not all words, but many words, they in and of themselves carry an air of inappropriateness with them, but generally it seems as though these curse words are becoming less and less meaningful, more and more expressive. They are sort of these carriers of emotion rather than carriers of carriers of basic emotion rather than carriers of something more, something larger. And so I want to try and understand exactly what a curse is in the context of this verse. Because the curse, as it is implied, is something that leads to his lamp being put out in obscure darkness. Now that in of itself is something that we have to explore, but it sounds certainly very ominous. And at the outset, I sort of want to go to my usual etymological chain and see what fruits that I can get from that. But I had a thought that when I had ran through this the first time, I don't think that I had searched up the etymology of the word curse. And so now I wonder, I think perhaps I ought to start with the second half of the verse first, and maybe forego the searching up of the etymology of the word curse. His lamp shall be put out in obscure darkness. It's not just darkness, for darkness is easy enough to understand. If it was darkness itself, part of me wants to say it would be sufficient. But another part of me is curious why the word obscure is used. As if darkness is anything other than obscure. If obscurity is to mean not discovered or known about, uncertain, not easily or clearly expressed or easily understood, not important or well known, hard to make out or define, vague. These are all qualities of darkness itself. It's interesting to add the word obscure. Now, of this lamp, let us picture for a moment a landscape, an illustration, that of a person in a cornfield, that is standing there at a particular time of the year, in a particular season. Let's say this is after harvest, which would mean it's getting cold out, the leaves are falling. So from this picture, we have a vast landscape all around us. Now let's say it is nighttime, but it's not a particular normal. It's not a typically normal, I should say, but it is a particularly dark night. There is no moon, there are no stars. And what we have is complete darkness. We know that we are on the earth, but because of the ground that we feel beneath our feet, and the smell of the landscape, the feel, the touch of the plants around us. Now for a moment, let's imagine that there is a wooden pole that we are standing just in front of. It's quite a large wooden pole. At the top of this wooden pole is a lamp. It could be any old lamp, it doesn't matter. It could just be a dangling light bulb. It doesn't matter. But we pull the cord and the light turns on. It's just a single light bulb. It's nothing special. It's not even one of those particularly bright ones. But within the landscape that we find ourselves in, within the suffocating darkness, that little light bulb illuminates quite a distance. But at the same time, we begin to understand what this obscurity is. Because as we look out into the nothingness, into the darkness, we discover the limits of that light, of how far it can actually permeate into the world. And at once we are amazed at how much one small light can illuminate the surrounding area. But at another instance, we are completely in awe and subsumed by the vast expanse of darkness. Now, on some level, the light represents intelligibility. It represents what is understood or known by the human mind. It represents his safety in that which is known. He can see that which is around him, and through his sight he is able to make better decisions, because he knows what's in front of him. He knows what's around him to a certain degree. On the other hand, the darkness is that void. It is the unknown, or the poorly understood. Now, in between these two extremes, we have the point at which the light begins to fade, perhaps rather rapidly, as one boundary approaches another. difficult to imagine, because how would we determine it? Is it the point that we can no longer see the ground beneath our feet? Is it the point that we can barely see the light in the distance? Is it the point where the primary halo of that light as it permeates the darkness ends? I'm not sure I know the answer, but in my mind I'm considering the point at which the halo ends. It just seems more of a satisfying image to picture. Now I'd like to go farther and ask the question, well, of light and of darkness we have some understanding thus far. We consider light as something that is stable, something that is understood and known by us who are in this illustration. But what does it mean then for something to be known and understood? What does it mean to be secure under the canopy of the light? In some sense, what it means to understand, be attentive and aware of that which is around you. And in some sense, I think that this security or safety comes from awareness. And we have to ask the question, well, is this awareness absolute attention? And I don't think it is. Because it is not as though we are paying attention to every little piece of corn husk, of harvested corn. We're not necessarily even paying attention to the pole upon which that light is fixed. We are sort of part of this experience of possibility of readily available information. If we wanted to, we could turn around and look at that pole. We can examine it. We can examine it in particular detail, more perhaps than is necessary at the given moment. And same for all things that are visible in that environment. But in our image, the mind doesn't necessarily go to the examination of the pole, or of the light, or of the light bulb, or of the plant matter beneath our feet. It goes to assure us that we have some stake, that we have some place, belonging. In a world that is otherwise unknown, potentially dangerous. And I can go farther and talk about his experience in this sort of environment, in this world, but it may not be necessary, because we're going back to that word curse. But before we get there, I want to mention this word obscure darkness. Again, it seems like these words, the word obscure ought not to be there. It would seem to imply that darkness may have another function than to be obscure, or to be something that is not discovered or known. Uncertain. And I think that we can say that it is these things. But certainly there is darkness under the light. And by that I mean that there is darkness at another level, perhaps. That it is almost layered darkness. That the mind within that perceptual landscape is put at ease because it understands and it feels it is part of the existence of the whole, but it only can grasp various aspects, and yet its faith in the whole is what makes that light sort of comforting to him. It makes him know that what is around him is knowable. that there is some way to understand that existence, that reality that he finds himself in. Now, obviously, the analogy breaks down a little bit if we just consider that within this landscape he has other sense organs by which he can interpret the world, but let's put that aside for now and just say that the true thing here is the light bulb that's giving him this experience of life and of reality. But again, this darkness is layered, it is nested, and that it's not necessarily that he has to know every single thing that is available to him. What matters is that he is connected to that thing that allows him to know. The obscure darkness, I think, is that place which he can find himself if he walks too far away from the light, for which the light can no longer permeate into that type of darkness. Then he is truly in a region that is undiscoverable, unknown. And what then does that mean for him? He's in a place of nothingness, purposelessness. His lamp shall be put out in obscure darkness. Now we have to imagine that action, his lamp, that light that is hanging from that wooden post. That thing is going to be subsumed by that obscurity, by that obscure darkness. Not the darkness that we can attribute to the various layers within the intelligible world or intelligible reality that he chooses not to experience. Not because he doesn't want to, perhaps, but because it's not relevant at a given moment. His mind is limited, and it cannot be something that experiences that, or the whole of that. Now, you can experience it to a degree, but there's a certain level of knowing which will be beyond him to know all of the available bits and pieces that make up that reality. So where does the curse come in? Well, the curse is the lamp being put out in obscure darkness. So, in this way, if we take the word shit or fuck, these are two contemporary curse words. Now, when I say those things, it doesn't immediately seem to me that my ability to understand the world has been extinguished. And I think the reason for that is that these are not true curse words. But then that leads to reason why or what form or combination or what word in general. Now, it may be a word that on the surface may not seem like it would lead to a lamp of the mind being put out in obscure darkness. And it may have sort of a chain of causal effects that then leads to it downstream. But before we get there, is there a word, sort of low-hanging fruit, that we might imagine would cause this? Now, I think a curse is also contextual. It depends on certain circumstances in order for it to take effect and to take hold. Almost like in Harry Potter, when they say the word Voldemort, it is invoking something. They're not supposed to say it. And it's not necessarily something that is not connected to reality. It certainly is. But in our case, as our language interacts with the world, as it interacts within ourselves and between us, certainly there must be a setup. Just like a person doesn't get in a car crash without being in a car. And so we can imagine any number of cars that are in the parking lot. I could look out my window right now, and I could look down into the parking lot as I live a few stories up into the air, and I could see a variety of different cars. As I look down and I examine them, it's sort of like me. This is a weird analogy, but I'm trying to really milk that car analogy. It's as if I see a curse word, let's say, for example. Now, in a certain sense, I can look down and I could see its potential. Let's say I examine an experience. Since we are concerned with a lamp being put out in obscure darkness, in this way I am considering a fatal car crash, going 80 miles an hour into a concrete wall without a seatbelt. As I look down into the parking lot and I see these various cars, I could see the potential for this to happen, but I'm not seeing it happen. And so it doesn't mean that the cars down below are going to be the thing that kill me. It is the circumstances that are set up around the vehicle. And if we are to say that money and language are vehicles, or transmission, what do the economists say? They say that money is a medium of exchange. Language, likewise, is a medium of exchange, an exchange of meaningful information, purposeful information. The car is itself a vehicle. It conveys us, meaningful beings. But it is not until we have a certain relationship to that car, that we are inside of it, that we have it turned on, that we are moving it in a particular direction, that we have reached a certain speed. We have done all of these different intentional moments. In this way, there is sort of a causal chain set up such that, in the context of the curse word, as sort of laying over this analogy, or in the background of this analogy, this sequence of events must occur in order for the car, that vehicle, to be the thing that leads to my death. I think much like the curse word, or like a curse sentence, there has to be a series of events. There has to be intentional events that lead up to the eventual death, or the lamp being put out in obscure darkness, which is a form of death. So then that brings us, I think, to the first half of the verse. Whoso curseth his father or his mother. Now we could think of all sorts of different things here. We could ask the question, well, why his mother or his father? We could say, well, since we understand this now about the curse, how then do we describe it, this event, in the context of the first half, in the context of cursing the mother and the father? Well, the mother and the father are pillars of development, of growth, of renewal, of nurturing. They are the ones that set up the engine that the human being is, that conscious engine for which that conscious engine interprets reality. They are setting up that very thing. They are almost like setting up the light bulb within that darkness. Or rather, it is not the light bulb itself, it is the mind to exist within the light. I think that's more of an appropriate way to say it. And so if one is to put out the light that had, if one is to say, I think this is the curse. If one is to say that they wish, that they desire, that they intend, that there's the key word, that they intend to remove that vessel or vehicle by which they are allowed to experience the world, that they are allowed to experience reality, that they are given any chance at all to see what is illuminated by that light, then they themselves will lose their ability to see and experience and be part of reality. And I think not necessarily because they're going to be, put to death by some lightning bolt that comes out of nowhere. I think it's because it's a certain corruption of mind. We talk of the wicked, we talk of evil, we talk of the foolish. All three have this thread of selfishness through them, in varying degrees, of course, the foolish, then the wicked, then the evil. But there's a certain corruption of mind that accompanies behavior and action and language, and any meaningful vehicle for which value is exchanged. I think that vehicle is subject to decay over time. If, let's say in the economic example, if one inflates that money supply away, they make it so abundant, like the grains of sand on a beach, that everybody can just go to the beach and pick up a handful of sand. Now, perhaps at one time, 2 grains of sand, let's say, afforded one an apple. And now everybody comes into the store with bags and bags of sand. Whereas before, perhaps, everybody had a handful or so of sand to their name. Or perhaps a few people had a handful of sand to their name. And now everybody seems to have these bags full of sand. Does that mean then that everyone can buy an apple? Well, in some universe, maybe. It's possible that everybody goes to the store and buys an apple, and then there's a shortage, and then the price of apples go up. That's one possibility. Another possibility, that when we zoom out a little bit from the apple, we consider other goods, and we consider that there's so much more money and purchasing power out there, so much more goods are being sold. This, I think, in the short term would have some pretty good effects for the nation, for the people. Employment opportunities would probably be skyrocketing. There would be some changing in dynamics, surely, of money as it changes hands. But if we go back to the beach, and we just keep on renewing that beach, such that it really doesn't matter how much money there is. There's an infinite supply of it. Or worse, that it is actually an infinite supply, or seemingly infinite supply, is controlled by a select group of people. We don't need to get into contemporary examples, but what I would like to make here is that we can sort of imagine, of the different possibilities that exist, of all the ways that we can put intention into the world, there's but a very few that would result in a curse. There's but a very few that would find us in the situation, in the car, whether we're driving or as a passenger, and intentionally drive into a wall at 80 miles an hour without a seatbelt. Likewise, there are a very limited number of circumstances for a person to corrupt the minds of those who had brought that person into the world, that gave them, that mind, the ability to experience reality underneath the light. But there are circumstances, and I think the curse could be from the mother or the father, that can extend down to the child, that then curses upwards. I was just listening to a story today about somebody that was raped and abused by their father, and this is certainly a curse. This is a curse of action, a curse of behavior. But there's all sorts of verbal abuse too that was all horrendous. This person was sharing a story, this was a podcast sharing a story of how he was made to point a gun to this homeless person's head in an abandoned house, and his father placed his hand over his son's hand around that trigger and pulled it and shot the man in the head and killed him. And all the while he's, I believe, if I remember correctly, saying things like, if you don't kill him, I'll kill you, or whatever. And this is a curse. This is something that stays with. That type of intention stays with the child. Thankfully, he was saved. He was saved by the likeness of Christ, the likeness of God. But glory be to that light that can save us, that can bring us back to it. It is certainly something to take heed of, to consider that capacity for curse that man has. And I'd like to round out the analogy that I was using about the grains of sand being sort of like bits of money. Going back to what I was saying about all of the potential, all of that possibility. There's potential for a million different things. And then we say, okay, we filter it, and we say, what about potential for evil or for wickedness? What about the potential for a thread through different experiences that would lead one to purposelessness and meaninglessness? We can find them. And I think the same can be applied just as much as it can be applied to the concerns of that absolute, which is that experience of reality. But it can also be applied to those aspects of reality, like our language, like any vehicle, like I use that physical analogy of the automotive, or of our money, which is just a vehicle of exchange of value. If that vehicle of exchange becomes something that is taken, that is driven by somebody that wants to go 80 miles an hour and asks us to get in because the ride is inherently valuable to us, that we need that money to survive and to participate in the world to a certain degree, and he drives it, he could drive it into the wall, but he would die, so he's probably not going to do that, but he drives it into his underground bunker, and he locks us in that car. Now, this situation changes the dynamics a bit. This is a curse. This is a curse that is placed on man for being invited into the intention of evil. And I just say all of that because it's quite an expansive picture that this can exist in. And as I had described before in previous episodes, that what lies on the periphery, in the shadowy periphery, just as that light begins to fade and to be extinguished altogether, then we can say, well, what does that actually mean? Because the light seemingly is the divine here. But it may just be man's conception of the divine. It could be just his cultural map. I'm not really sure where this analogy can actually extend to, but nonetheless, at the periphery of what man can see, his understanding, I think it is actually, because it would be his understanding of the whole. I talked before about the layers of that darkness. And it is not necessarily the aspect that is the thing that keeps him safe. It is the intelligibility of the whole, of his place and experience and being in the whole, and his capacity to understand the aspects. That's really the thing. It's the dynamism between that being of whole and understanding of aspect. And so at the periphery of his understanding of being itself, can lie these shadowy figures. And these shadowy figures are the things that I think have that potential for a curse. They are just enough, they possess just enough agency, not that they're completely crippled by addiction or whatever. Their minds are still somewhat functional. Even those that are completely corrupted by addiction, I think, can, and often do. We think of crackheads, meth heads that break into people's houses and steal things or commit unspeakable acts of violence like beheadings and certain things. These shadowy figures are the ones that have this potential to curse. And of course the true evil are the ones that are within that, well within that light. They are not really on the periphery. But they choose by their own will to bring and invite the darkness in and take from others. An inheritance may be gotten hastily at the beginning, but the end thereof shall not be blessed. So the first question is, what does it mean by an inheritance may be gotten hastily at the beginning? And I think to get into that question, we have to talk about what an inheritance is. On one hand, the first thought that comes to mind is it is a familial affair. That is, the mother and the father of a particular generation passed down what they have earned in their lives, perhaps a property, commonly today, down to their children so that they may have it, so their condition in life is better because of it. But that's not the whole of it, because we can imagine this property being passed down. But again, it's like dollars changing hands. What exactly does it mean? I suppose there are various reasons why dollars are exchanged. Again, the economic distinction for money, that it is a medium of exchange. Now, inheritance, we also see this pattern of passing. Now, I don't necessarily wish to make a direct connection between that of money as a medium of exchange and that of passing down property. I think that the contextual cues in the word inheritance is much greater than that which we find in the passing of dollars, because it's not just the passing of property for any old reason. It is the passing of the property within. It is within the family, within some structure. We call inheritance the passing down of something to an heir, of property to an heir. That is somebody that will take up the mantle, another interesting expression. and continue their life, or continue life in general. And in this way we have a symbolic act that one, to take up the mantle is to take up responsibility. That the passage of this property within that structure of the family, now it doesn't mean that this always is the case, but I think it is intended to be the case that if anything is to encompass the family, it is love. The boundaries around that family, the walls around that family surely should be love. And insomuch as I can draw the conclusion or the parallel between, or some similarity to, that of money being a medium of exchange, the passage of property within that framework, that city of the family, the principality of the family, it is a transmission of value, I think. But it's not value that is void of a particular, as I've said, I want to say institution, I want to say principality. It has certain structural constraints to it. Just like we might imagine that liberalism without its constraints, where it's liberalism all the way down, is a much different thing than liberalism given certain moral and theoretical constraints that are constant through the culture. And the passage of this property is of the latter sort. It is of the sort that are held together, bounded by this love within the family. Now, what is being passed, I mentioned, was a responsibility. It is value to a certain degree. But that, even on its surface, really doesn't describe the point. Okay, so it's a responsibility. It is some duty. It can be seen as something worn like a backpack, that it has some weight in it. It is something to be carried. It's something to be accomplished. There's a lot of memories, and there's a lot of experiences that are remembered in the passage of property within the family. And I've said every family, I think, does this differently. Surely there are families that are more functional than others. But duty, it is a moral obligation. Again, it's a responsibility, but what is one obliged to do exactly if something is inherited? So they are obliged, which means they are bound. And so we ask the question then, what binds them? We can answer that question by saying it's love. Okay. But then we find ourselves in more sticky territory again. What then about this love? Let's say the parents have passed away. The remaining parent has died of old age, and now the inheritance goes down to the children. In what way is the child bound to the obligation that is packaged within the property? Well, I suppose in some sense that they are bound by a commitment. They are bound by the promise that they will create something, that they will continue that trajectory of binding, so that they are bound to their predecessor. It's a strange way to say that, but in the sense of the family. And what they do with that property is they use it to facilitate further binding. And again, many cases it doesn't happen, sometimes it does. But I think inheritance in this way is a transmission through time that force of binding that binds human beings together throughout the generations. In some sense, what is being, and we can extend this to all sorts of different things. I mean, the act of bringing a child into the world itself is an act of binding. There are many acts of breaking, surely, but so we have this image of things that are bound together. Rather than being lost, rather than being desperate. The inheritance provides a bit of orientation because of its obligation, because something is directed. It is a nudging in a particular direction, saying, this is what you must do. Don't be idle. Don't be afraid of the unknown. Now, what's interesting here in the first half is an inheritance may be gotten hastily at the beginning. Now, what does it mean for one to get an inheritance hastily at the beginning? In haste, it means to get, it is something that is fast, it is something that is quick. Fastness and quickness in and of itself, I don't think really have a negative connotation to it. But when it's coupled with the word, the beginning, one has to ask the question, well, at the beginning of what? An inheritance may be gotten hastily at the beginning. Now, there are many different types of beginnings. Now, I think one possibility here is the beginning of life, or a point at which an inheritance is likely to be given upon the death of a parent. Hastily, I think, would imply that the inheritance is being given before the point of death. I think of somebody that is quite wealthy, that has means to provide some substantial contribution to a child's well-being, even before the parent has died. An inheritance may be gotten hastily at the beginning. At the beginning, at first, perhaps we can also say. It could be in the sense of firstness. It could be when it is combined with this haste. It could be something that is sudden. And the beginning is something that like an explosion of consciousness. All of a sudden, it is here, it exists. It's fast and quick, and this new thing is now the beginning. The way of life with the substantial inheritance is this new beginning. But the speed at which it is got, I think, is particularly key. And I think part of this has to do with an inheritance that is not deserved. It's a responsibility that cannot be accepted or undertaken. It is a duty that is beyond the ability for the inheritor to, again, accept or to bear the burden. It becomes a burden rather than a meaningful obligation. An inheritance may be gotten hastily at the beginning, but the end thereof shall not be blessed. Now, why would that be? Now, surely it could be the case that of a family, an unfortunate circumstance can befall them, in which the mother or the father or both can die, let's say in a car accident. Upon this, there is this suddenness in which the children, let's say that they are of age, inherit something. Would we say then that the children are not blessed? Well, in a sense we could say that, because they receive the inheritance under extreme and dramatic circumstances. But that's too superficial. The word blessed, I think, has much more within it than just that of what I've described. But I think there's an element in what I've described that gets at the point. And that is the speed at which something occurs, I think, can catch one off guard. And off guard is an interesting expression, because exactly what are we guarding? Well, we are guarding, I think, to go back to the analogy with ourselves underneath this light pole. In some sense, what we are guarding, the reason that we stay beneath that light, is in some sense for safety, in some sense for security, in some sense because we know that that sphere is able to hold our consciousness. And much like this analogy of having some sphere of intelligibility that can hold consciousness, I think there's an extension by which we can say that there are spheres, perhaps, that contain within them the relationship or the standard that is required to accept certain responsibilities. And moral truths are difficult to see. They often require a quite specific and sophisticated key, I think, to unlock. Much like the curse, there has to be a specific pattern in order for the curse to take hold. It must lock on to a certain probability of an event occurring and take it through all the way to its conclusion. In some sense, it is similar to that. Just in the other direction, of course, in the sense of goodness. When one finds a moral truth, it is not as though they are cursed. They are enlightened by what they have discovered. It's a principle by which they can orient themselves. And so I think that within this word blessed, we find the principles around which people can orient themselves. The principles around which there is this sphere of possible existence of mind. Without it, certain elements of mind just cannot exist. They cannot survive within a particular soil. And it's not as though just because an inheritance is gotten hastily that the mind cannot survive at all. That's certainly not the case. There are plenty of plants that survive in otherwise inhospitable environments, and there's plants that thrive in areas of higher latitude, or there's plants that survive that are closer to the equator, and so on. There's much diversity in this regard. But all the same, when we are talking about something as fundamental as love as a binding force, and how it can move through us, move through our societies, and connect people together, it is something at once that is mysterious to us because we can't hold on to it as firmly perhaps as we would like. We can't ride it every day just continually as a vertical up like an elevator to heaven. Unfortunately, our minds are not strong enough to do that. Or perhaps I should say my mind is not strong enough to do that. But part of me, I think, would like to say by reason that even among the most pious of individuals, that there are times in life, perhaps there are times throughout the day, however mundane they might be, in which we just don't have that sense of connectedness that we all desire. It doesn't mean that we don't have it in our lives. We have enough to keep us going. But the tank isn't always full, in other words. And I think going along with that, and that it's not just the tank that is full, it's the size of the tank. It is how much we are actually able to see. It is our level of consciousness, our level of experience. This is what I refer to. I don't mean to say that human beings are irredeemable or that it's not possible to find heaven. I'm just merely recognizing the condition of man. So to round out this verse, I'd like to bring back into the conversation that word haste. That is, too quick for something to occur. My mind jumps to the analogy of a plant that is growing. There are many factors that go into a successful nurturing of a plant from the seed. And part of that has to do with before the seed is even planted, the soil must be competent enough to allow that seed to take and to grow. If the seed is hastily planted, that means it's either there's a physical misplacement of that seed, it's not buried too deep enough, or it's buried in the wrong place, or the soil is insufficient to nurture that seed. Nevertheless, it's all based on the condition. And if conditions are right, which may take time in order for it to be prepared to be able to accept that seed, then the seed will grow. And much like this inheritance, if the relationship between the family and the heir is poor, and that there is no cultivation of love, then that infrastructure, that highway by which meaning and value can travel through that inheritance will be lost. It is much like in the economic sense, that if money is this basic exchange, or basic medium of exchange of value, one can spend money on all sorts of different things. It doesn't mean that that's what they buy is actually going to be valuable to the person that buys it. Nor is it guaranteed that an inheritance that is passed down to an heir will be a blessing, because that inheritance is placed upon a weak foundation, or whatever context, whatever principles are required to uphold that inheritance and to hold it and to continue it are not there. And the weight of the inheritance can be too much, surely, for an heir that is unsuspecting or undeserving. Say not you, I recompense evil, but wait on the Lord, and he shall save you. So I think this verse is going to take some time to unpack. Anytime a verse has the word Lord in it, it must be considered quite deeply. Not that others shouldn't. Say not you, I will recompense evil. So part of this has to do with understanding that word recompense. Another is going to have to do with the word evil. So let's start with this word recompense. Recompense means to make amends to someone for a loss or harm suffered, to compensate. Just continuing with these definitions here, pay or reward someone for work or effort. Similar words, compensate, indemnify, repay, reimburse. Now, to compensate somebody for something is to give somebody something, and typically money, as it is described here in my quick Google search, in recognition of loss, suffering, or injury occurred. Another definition of compensate is reduce or counteract something unwelcome or unpleasant by exerting an opposite force or effect. So what might it mean to recompense evil? Now, recompense is derived from Latin. Recompensare, meaning to weigh out together. Originally, it referred to the act of balancing scales or making something equivalent in weight. It had evolved to mean a correction of something, to return to some previous balance that was. In Middle English, the meaning of compensating or balancing something out, but often in the context of making amends for a loss, injury, or wrong, which is sort of where we have arrived with our Google search definition. And so all of this is very strange in the context of evil. What amends are we making to evil? What balance are we trying to bring back to this interesting word? So what of evil? What can we say? Now, thus far I've been discussing evil as sort of in a family of three words here. We have foolish, then we have wickedness, and then we have evil. And that general scale of severity I've followed, where foolishness, they all differ, but they all have some common thread that connects them. Part of it is their selfishness, or general unawareness, or inattentiveness. Wickedness and evil is the upper limits of selfishness, and evil is the point at which selfishness takes hold regardless of one seeing and perhaps even understanding the truth. That somebody is so lost that even the truth will not dissuade them from their actions. Moreover, if we bring in the analogy of this environment with the light bulb, and on the periphery there is this fading light into the ever-expanding darkness. Now there are beings, I suppose we can call them, that exist on this periphery. They are neither consumed in darkness nor illuminated in light. And this is sort of the periphery that they wish to dwell in. They wish to remain somewhat hidden, protected to a certain degree by the unknown and perhaps the unknowable. And I think partly this is done for matters of temptation, that these figures at the precipice tempt one into their state. They fundamentally are oriented towards that darkness. They want all to be consumed by it. The great irony is that, of course, they themselves would be consumed by the very belief that they hold. And their existence in that sort of liminal state between the understandable and completely knowable to that of complete destruction and unknowing is such a bizarre and predatory place to inhabit. Not that liminality itself is a bad thing, but certainly if one occupies that space in particular, that precipice in particular, there seems to be a contradiction of experience. Now, to recompense those that are on this precipice, and those that wish to bring the darkness in, and to obscure that light so nobody can see, perhaps so that they could take advantage. Now, if we are to imagine the scales of justice, and if we are to take evil as an identity that one can inhabit, and if we are to say of identities that the various identities and experiences that one can have ought to be equal in a cultural sense, perhaps when one sees in this courtroom, when one sees a dip in the execution of a sentence or some determination against, instead of a conception of justice that is based on the good, they wish, rather, to say that equality is the supreme good. And despite the pitfalls within various identities, all identities in and of themselves must be treated equally. Now, I think there's an element of that in our culture today, not to the extreme, or perhaps maybe it is to the extreme. Evil has a quite subtle way about it. But this recompensing, this return to balance, or to make amends with evil, I find it difficult to understand what that actually means. Why would one even want to make an amend with evil? What loss can evil experience that one would want to compensate them? And I'm trying to think of how this would work outside of money. Money is such a foolish thing. It diverts our problem solving. At least, it's a foolish thing in as far as a way to solve an issue. Now, there are ways in which that statement might not be correct, but it's foolish in the sense that to compensate somebody for injury or harm, let's say. Money may be able to return the material things, but here we are not talking about a material thing. We're talking about something of the heavenly sphere. I know it's strange to say something like that in terms of evil, but it exists within that dimension. And so our medium of exchange in that dimension cannot be dollars. It must be something else. So what currency do we use then for this recompense of those at the fringe? And it's not just those at the fringe. It is those at the boundary between the intelligible and unintelligible that wish either to control or to subsume everything within that darkness. And I would like to say that just like liminality, those at the fringe, I suppose it's a synonym, that of the fringe, and sort of that at the precipice, at that boundary. There are many boundaries that can exist. One boundary, one important one, is that between the intelligible and unintelligible. That is all I'm saying. Well, we can use power. We can use love. We could use any number of things that would bring evil to a higher status in society or in our lives. I think another medium of exchange is attention. That's quite a powerful one. If one is going to attend to evil, they are, in some sense, compensating them for... I see such a contradiction in terms here, because I want to say if a harm is done to evil, they are pushed more towards obscurity. They are placed within the confines of society for which they are that evil is unable to participate. And to compensate is to give them that attention that would then allow that evil to liberate itself from the lack thereof and to re-enter that intelligible sphere and regain its place out there at the periphery, or insidiously right underneath the light, for which they use as a shield those that are under it. They find within them a place to hide, and like a parasite, manipulate them, control them, to do their bidding. And in some sense, this recompense is an invitation. But there again lies the question, why? Why would this occur? Now, other than the case of some poor conception of justice, which I've described, another way I think that this can seep in is through the want of comfort, the want of safety, the want of security. And a man, I think, in pain or in extreme want or in a state of destitution will more easily accept the proposition of that unfortunate being that requires that unfortunate sacrifice. That it requires the attention in order for it to grow, much like that seed that I had mentioned. The attention is like the conditions for which it is able to exist. It is the road upon which it is able to drive. And giving it this platform, the platform of human experience, what we are putting into the world is darkness instead of light. Now, I think that there is a more poetic way in which I can approach this. Memories of the first time that I had went through this verse are coming back to me. And I'm reminded of this picture. A large picture of consciousness, that of the awareness that reality may have. Okay, this is a sort of a thought experiment, but the human being, let's say in our analogy underneath the light, he is but a piece of this relational sphere. He is a mind that is connected and at the same time disconnected. He's connected in the sense that he has the ability to experience and be self-aware and to put forth into the physical world that of a higher conscious being relative to the things around it. He could take the material, and from the immaterial world he can bridge that gap and connect the two. And we have to wonder, on some level, are they separated at all? For if man is to find himself born into this expanse of consciousness, if the reason that he can see is because something had given him light, then his actions and his behavior are upon the surface of this strange awareness that to him seems like a disjointed and at times meaningless existence, given the more he understands about the material world around him and his place in it and his insignificance. To him, he is sooner to consider that he is not like a tributary off of a main branch or a main river, but rather he is just a pond that is accumulated because for no reason. It is just there. It just exists. A rather strange thing to have a seed that was born without a tree. A rather strange thing to think about. I had this experience when I was a child. My parents had an interesting closet. It was not much of a closet, actually. It was more of a room in which there were a bunch of sliding doors that were all mirrors. And you could stand in such a way that when you look in the mirror, there is just this repeating reflection continually down into infinity. And it's hard not to fall into this type of imagery when one is thinking about the origin of consciousness and of experience and of being. But nevertheless, we need not get lost there. Even if we have this sort of conception of infinities, even if we are considering about looking into this mirror of that individual that repeats and repeats and repeats and repeats over and over. evil that comes into this frame at its core wishes to blot it out. And of the human being, the only thing that keeps the human being going is the deception, that its surrender and that its recompense to that attention to that evil has not completely undermined his will. And this issue of freedom of will, I think, is often a boring topic. Some say there is free will, some say there is not free will. Often those that say that there is not, often they have this weird roundabout way to saying that there is no will. But the unfortunate thing about losing all of that information is I had a good analogy for this, analogy that I certainly remember, but I suppose I can say it here. It is that of a network. I had brought up the analogy of Lord of the Rings with that giant tarantula and Frodo and Gollum, and that whole scene in which Frodo gets caught in that web. That imagery, I think, will come back at a later verse, but just for now, imagining this network of various nodes that are interconnected, that have some relationship to one another. We could say on one hand that there is no freedom of will because of all the various constraints that the relationships placed on us. But in another sense, we can say that there is freedom of will because despite those constraints, beneath a certain number of them, we can modify some, and of course we are constrained by certain fundamentals. But within fundamentals, we are allowed to move, we are allowed to exercise certain freedoms. Just like in a democratic republic, in the political situation, we call ourselves free people, and yet we recognize the rule of law. We recognize that actions have consequences. And we recognize that there are limitations to our freedoms, or rather I should say our movement, and perhaps that there is a misconception between freedoms and acceptable modes of transmission or of movement, of whatever we might want to call it. A physical analogy is easy to see, that there are certain things that I can think of in my mind that I may wish to do or to will to do, and yet I'm constrained by my physical ability. Certainly I cannot fly, I'm constrained by gravity. I cannot transport myself by virtue of my physical makeup. I must follow certain rules, certain laws. But within those rules and within those laws, I am free. Much like in a free society, I am free, despite living under the thumb of the state. But like the nodes in a network, the nodes of the network are free agents. Their movement affects the network. Their relationships affect the structure of the network. And so in that respect, there is also freedom of will. For it is part of this broader will, perhaps we can say. And this recompense of evil, if we view it in this way, of a relationship of wills that are connected to each other, What we are bringing in is this dysfunction of the network, of that expansion of relatedness. We are causing dysregulation, corruption. We're causing blockages, perhaps we can say, of vessels from transmitting appropriate information. Wait on the Lord, and he shall save you. So in what way does waiting on the Lord save us? What is the Lord in this situation? How can we conceptualize, out of everything that we have discussed so far, where does this word, Lord, fit? What does its endowment with meaning have for us? So we are waiting on something. In cases where we feel or we are susceptible to that weakness for which we would rather see evil away from the periphery, away from that condition, because it can offer ourselves some liberation from a constraint that we ought not to be liberated from. Another interesting conception that evil is perhaps a part of our will. Obviously, it is a part of our will. It is something that can tempt us into believing that we can liberate ourselves from something that we ought not to liberate ourselves from, nor can we be liberated from. And this question of liberation, I think, comes in this word, Lord. Wait on the Lord. Because what we are waiting on is the constraint. We are waiting on the law. We are waiting on justice. We are waiting on that account for which we can understand what the next step should be. We are being discerning. We are not taking the hand of that which would tempt us into darkness on the promise of the opposite. There must be some way in which we can calm our minds and open ourselves to that truth that would allow that light to permeate in. Again, that's the understanding. That is the way of seeing. And the advice here is to wait. Let it pass. Let the knock at the door cease. Regain composure. Breathe a full breath of air. For it always comes back. It always comes back. And he shall save you from that man that was at that door. That door that at once you opened, and it was just another threshold that you went through. Instead, now that node in the network that knocks on that door, or perhaps we shouldn't say it's a node in the network, but it is a deception of will. That for whatever reason says to man, your insecurities are all but dissolvable if you break that which if you break that which binds you, and you come undone, you cross over this threshold, for you've done it before in your life. You have crossed many thresholds. This one is no different. Don't let that liminal experience dissuade you. In fact, welcome that experience. Again, you've seen it before. But that is that temptation, and the crossover to the other side is not that light. It's not the new experience. It's not a new responsibility that you accept. It is darkness. It is that ever-sucking experience, that pit of Sheol for which the minds of the living as well as the dead go, that we see in the Psalms. The psalmists were apt for that description. Such an interesting thing for the living to have the mind that is similar to the dead, or to inhabit a place that is similar. Now, hopefully I can be forgiven. Today is a new day, and I'm starting in the middle of a thought which I hate doing, but inevitably I convinced myself at the time of stopping that I'll be able to pick up where I left off with ease, and invariably it's quite difficult to pick up again, in the same train of thought at least. So I may have to retrace some steps in order to finish this verse. Now I am somewhat satisfied with what I have come to thus far as what exactly this relationship is, perhaps to evil, how it can come in, what our relationship might be to it, under what situations. But all the same, I'm not entirely sure I'm satisfied with the usage of recompense, and that is to say, I think that there is some more work to be done unpacking that word recompense in relationship to evil. I think in general, the approach that evil may have to man in his weaker moments, where he is willing to accept certain deals for which he may sacrifice or give up a degree of attentiveness and orientation so that he may be pacified, or at least under the idea or the perception or under the promise that he will be satisfied. And my mind continually wants to go to saying, well, how in this relationship then is this evil being recompensed? Is it on the part of the individual that wishes this false promise to be brought into fruition, that he is saying that the evil that is forced to the periphery has been billed falsely or has been judged falsely, and that therefore this evil ought to be compensated for? There should be amends given to that identity. Now, this is one possibility, but this is the possibility that has been circling in my mind, that I think it's not unreasonable, but I think it is not satisfying enough. And I wonder if there is not another path that we can go down to determine or come to some clearer or more satisfying or a loftier explanation for this recompense of evil. So if you would allow me the ability to return to the drawing board, that blank canvas upon which we are afforded much by the direction and the pointedness of the Proverbs, that we are given our prompt, we are given our subject to paint. It is just a matter of finding the right words and putting together that illustration. So let's consider recompense again, this word. To make amends to someone for loss or harm suffered. To compensate. Now, surely, evil is not something that ought to be compensated. If we are to amend something, we are to make it fairer, more accurate, more up-to-date, perhaps. We are to modify it. We are to make it better. We are to improve it. Or we are to put it right. Now, all of that language seems to be contradictory, because if one is to believe that they are able to set right their relationship to evil, then they are mistaken. It is that their it is not as though that the human being is not related to evil. I think we all are. We all are in different ways and to different degrees. Our relationship to evil should be that of weariness, as if one were to be living close to an enemy, perhaps. If one is to be at war, I think of the Peloponnesian War, in which the Athenians were fighting against their neighbors, the Boteans. I'm not sure if that's how to pronounce it, but nevertheless, the interesting part of that conflict is the various confederacies, or confederates of the Athenians and of the Lacedaemonians, the two principal parties in that conflict, were spread around. And for all of the Athenian might and power, their very neighbors were not their own confederates, which I thought was strange. But the point being that their enemies were their neighbors, and their relationship to them would not be the same as if they were bordering an ally or a friend, or of their own kinsmen, for example. Now, I do think that there is a way in which one can have a relationship to evil in which they would want to amend evil such that it is no longer evil. But then we would not be commanded to say not, I will recompense evil. This making of amends is for some harm that is done to evil. And now I recognize that I'm going down quite a similar path as I had just done, but I'll continue nonetheless. And if one is to say that evil ought to be made right in the sense that their injustice ought to be altered, that it should be restored, then really what we are implying here is to restore a certain type of reciprocal relationship with evil, that we can do business with evil, that we can trade with it, that we can keep it as a part of our lives, that small bit of temptation is okay. But then the question is, at what cost? Who's to say that it can be limited, that it can be held within a small container? Now, certainly it is not within man's power to abolish evil outright. Certainly it is within his power to have a proper relationship to it, such that it is not something that infects him. Like he may have a proper relationship to the West Nile virus, he takes steps to avoid being contaminated by such a disease, perhaps wearing protective clothing when he is in the Amazon, so he is not bitten repeatedly by mosquitoes. In the same way, he ought to be aware and protected against this evil, rather than to invite it, to go to the Amazon in this state of naivety, or to believe that that West Nile virus is actually a good thing for him. And so again, we wait. I am satisfied with the reason why we wait. We wait so that temptation and the knocking goes away. We wait for, and now the word wait, I think the mind is quick to run to passivity and inaction. But I think that much like the word leisure, from a biblical standpoint, it does not entail laziness. It does not entail inaction. It does not entail being a couch potato. It entails an active sort of participation in that which would fulfill somebody, orient one in such a way that they are connected to those in their lives whom they love, or to things that will enhance their understanding, or to chores that need to get done around the house, or business that needs to be attended to within their life that's just outside of normal required labor. I think this wait is similar. We're not waiting for a lightning bolt to come out of the sky to strike down evil, or to serve us with some understanding. We are waiting in the sense that we are not quick to action, to misaction. The delay is until we place or we develop certain constraints or contextual supports that are required to make an effective decision. That waiting is sort of a discerning practice. It is an exercise in patience. That if we are tempted, or that if our enemy is next door, we are not quick to run into some action that would cause us serious harm, or that would pervert our attention to such a degree that we cannot come to understand bondedness and true connectedness. And he shall save you. And of course the question is, well, what are we being saved from? And I think that pit of Sheol is certainly up there on the list. But we are being saved from essentially what I've just mentioned, that state of attention, which goes along with the pit of Sheol, that one's mind can inhabit. That is, it's on one hand base in the sense of superficial, on the other hand perpetually distracted, and unable to see the broader landscape, unable to see the proper good, or even be oriented towards good in general, that they are just sort of a breeze on the earth, blowing here and there, but not really grounded, not really rooted. Divers weights are an abomination unto the Lord, and a false balance is not good. Now this is a verse that we have seen before in this chapter. Not exactly the same. Verse 10, divers weights and divers measures, both of them are alike abomination to the Lord. Now verse 23, divers weights are an abomination unto the Lord, and a false balance is not good. So of course the difference here is balance, false balance. Now of divers weights, now divers, that word means various or many. Weights. Now weights, within it is a weighted word, pun intended. I think within this weight, we are considering an ancient market. I'm considering an ancient market in my mind. And I'm considering the traditional method by which, or a standard by which, something has come to attribute value to something. And so I would imagine that there is this scale, this sort of economic scale. Sometimes that scale can be used to, in the context of justice. But in the case of economics, on one hand, we will have our standard weight, which might be a stone with some engraving on it that is a reference. That reference then holds a certain attachment, a certain relationship to value. And that sounds vague, which it is, but what does it mean to have a relationship to value? Well, it's, in some sense, I picture a nice polished stone that has been set by some standard, that is kept in a safe, perhaps by the governing authority, the king of the land. Because of this standard, because of the confidence that people may have, although it seems relatively arbitrary, which it might be, the point is that the people that come to the market have confidence in the standard reference. And so they can continually use it to have some axis around which they can determine what their goods are worth. But there's that term worth, just like value. But this worth implies an equivalence. Again, I have X number of pounds in my good that I'm putting on this scale, and it is balanced with X weight, reference weight. And as such, I am perhaps given a coin or this other medium of exchange that has value in and of itself, that has, what do I mean by that? That has value in and of itself. Well, when I say value, which I don't think that a coin encompasses the form of value, but what it does encompass is certain aspects that we might consider to be valuable. So again, what do I mean by that? Well, what we consider valuable is dependent. There's two different ways that we can go here. Value, we can set willfully in an arbitrary manner in our minds. Some might call this subjective. And the reason that one might call this subjective is because if a man values a piece of cake, for example, he can give some justification, he can give an account to his desire. But another might say that his account that he gives to his desire is not sufficient to justify the value or the sacrifice that has taken place. That the money that he spent on this cake was not equivalent to what he had spent on it. And yet, there's another person, we can say the seller, that says, my good, the cake that I'm selling, is worth this much, is equivalent to that much value in the standard. Now, part of this relationship, this economic relationship, depends on the people that are buying, obviously. But the standard is a standard of man. And moreover from that, I think that oftentimes, at least in the modern world with material abundance, the standard of man can be quite low. But also, the standard of man is enough for a free market, a relatively free market, to provide and to produce and to maintain a certain standard of living. But all the same, it requires individuals in the society to take that leap and take that step forward to place something might be seen as true value into the system. That when somebody develops something new, a new technology or a new service, and people buy it, we say that it is valuable because of the remuneration, because of the money that is received for the services that are rendered. It doesn't mean that this new service or technology is truly valuable, but it does mean that there is attention to something, and perhaps what people identify as an aspect of something maybe wholly is not all that great for an individual, but there's an aspect of it that is particularly appealing. I mean, smartphones are sort of like this. There are plenty of downsides with smartphones, but there are also plenty of upsides. It depends on how the user is to use it. Conversely, but also kind of in the similar vein, it's just down the road a little bit. The scales are tipped in terms of justice, are tipped a little bit towards the unjust, that of the opioid epidemic and the creation of these pills that are so effective at relieving pain and whatever, that they have negative consequences. They have this probability for dependence and for addiction. And the market and the controls, the constraints that were placed on that addictiveness, the temptation, what we might consider as something that is a relationship to an evil, because of the potential for perverting the mind, disrupting the mind's attention towards nothingness, essentially, towards true inaction. That this thing that was created in the market that a lot of money has gone towards, and if that medium of exchange of value is going towards that, then people find it valuable. But in terms of a standard, an objective standard above all of those man-made reference standards, it is not so that it is a good thing, although there may be sort of good aspects, but the good aspects are sort of like the fish that lie in the deep sea, that have that little hook or luminescent thing, I don't know what you would call it, but it juts out. It's an appendage that just juts out of their forehead, and they wiggle it about until fish come by thinking that it is prey for them to eat, and once they have come close, the predator then snatches up the fish. And in this way, it may not be the person that created the product. It could be the product itself that has carried with it this potential. But of course, the person that relationship and the development of that relationship to an evil or tempting type product like the opioids without sufficient controls, much like a snake, it sort of it preyed on the mind of man, and it had found a particular infrastructure that was also produced by the minds of man, such that they set up ways around certain restrictions, such that the availability was quite high, and the physicians that pushed those pills were either they were themselves remunerated, or they were pushed by the companies to sell these pills as or to prescribe these pills as that miracle drug. And eventually the snake finds its hooks in that victim, in the mind of that victim. It's that poisonous parasite that takes hold of the tree, and it sort of rots it from within. Now, that's nothing to say of the diver's weights. This is just sort of weights in general, and how the weights can go wrong or how they can go bad in a society that is completely liberated from a relationship to the standard that is beyond them. Now, as it is concerned with variability, I think this is another possible road that one can go down. Now, the road that I had gone down was just one of human failure, the lack of foresight, and of temptation and deception. Not all that dissimilar, I think, is having various standards by which one can measure equivalence. Because if there are various standards, then there are various equivalencies. And it's possible to have multiple different equivalencies, surely, as there are multiple different currencies. But perhaps in the hands of one there is potential for deception. The weights may not be as standardized as people think. There can be corruption on that end, where one weight of a certain value and another weight of the same value may actually be different weights in reality, which is a type of fraudulent behavior. But I don't think that this really gets at the heart of what is being explained here. But rather, I should say that what I have mentioned here is but an aspect of the broader meaning. The fraudulent behavior, the injustice, I think, is an aspect, certainly. But this aspect is beyond one particular circumstance, a circumstance whether it be on the part of the patron or on the part of the institution, the political party perhaps that is responsible for the weights, or maybe it's who knows, whoever is responsible for the production of some standard. I think at the root of this, what we are concerned with is a common understanding. In some sense, it's a common standard. In some sense, it's a much broader in the context of economics. For example, I think that the standard is, I'm trying to get away from using the same word again, but it is an aspect. But it depends. We can ask the question, well, what is this standard, the weight, an aspect of? Well, it's an aspect of the broader whole that is the measurement of something by which we can determine what is actually valuable. And I think that the determination and the way in which we come to understand that which is valuable is important. Not only that we have this common understanding, but I would say that the commonness can be polluted in and of itself. You can have a common conception of something, or you can have a tyranny that is common to all, and yet the tyranny itself is unjust. It's good that there is some common rule, perhaps. And so, what is it that I am saying? That in some sense, the weight, or the thing by which we can come to some common understanding that is representative of that deeper principle, if that is variable, and it's variable to such a degree that when somebody encounters this variation that they are unable to go down that path to find some equivalency, whether it be in relatively superficial matters like economics, or relatively or quite profound matters in terms of purpose, perhaps in existential concerns, they find themselves on a road that is not finished. I can imagine a car that is driving along the highway, and then all of a sudden the highway just sort of drops. It drops to such a degree that it would mean certain death. In an example that's not so extreme, I can imagine a situation in which a bunch of electrons are traveling down a wire, and there is some break in the continuity of the wire, such that from the power source to that of the utility, let's say the light bulb, there is no common passage, so that the power is unable to produce that light. Or if there is a severed nerve in the body somewhere, the information from the periphery cannot reach the perceiving element, the mind. And unawareness ensues. And I think in the broader cultural landscape it is sort of like this. There is a break in continuity, such that the flow of information stops. It is unable to continue to fulfill its purpose. And if there are too many roads, too many wires, too many potential paths for diversion, such that the diversion is not centered on directing or diverting that information to the endpoint, to the purposeful endpoint, but rather just sort of to divert and potentially lose that information or that signal in that process of diversion, or to lessen it, whatever it might be, just to alter it in some way that is suboptimal, or more than suboptimal, just completely by its variability or by its lack of commonality, that the continuity no longer exists. That this then, that this disruption of information is an abomination to that thing which is the centerpiece of the network. The network exists because of that centerpiece. It is the thing that holds it together. It allows the nodes not to fly off and dissipate into nothingness. They are sort of gravitationally bound in some sense to this conscious informational mechanism. Or a better word would be being or agent. And a false balance is not good. Now, what does it mean by a false balance? So let's start with the word balance. If we are to imagine in our minds what something balanced looks like, I consider the scales. I consider that ancient market for which they use that scale of equivalency, and that level, once it reaches one side is level to another, then we have found the equivalency in weight between two items, perhaps between the standard and the sale, the good of sale. We could think of balance sort of in a physiological context, in which one is said to have good balance when they are able to maintain a certain posture. Usually it is balancing on one leg or in a particular position. If they are able to hold a position, given certain constraints, they are said to have good balance or to be in balance. And so of this balance, I think of two words. I think of stability, and I think of equivalence. I think of both the word equilibrium and equal. But herein lies, I think, a connection to what we were talking about earlier. That diverse weights are an abomination to the Lord, because something within the variability disrupts the common connection, the connection by which information flows. Of balance, of equal, of something that is level, there is, I think, a further place that we can go, that is to the word same. And I think determining and examining sameness is important, because there is a relationship between sameness and commonness. Now, there are a lot of different avenues, I think, that we can go down here, but to dwell on the word same for a moment. What does it mean for something to be the same, or at least similar, to something else? Now, we can talk of the thing itself, or we can talk of something that it is related to. And so what do I mean by that? So taking the first thing, the thing itself, we are thinking intra-object, within the object, where there is equivalence, where there is sameness. And there are many objects for which one object can be identified and compared to another object, but there are aspects of an object that we compare to other aspects of the same object that are not necessarily the same. And what I mean by that is I look directly in front of me, and there is a remote control. The remote control certainly has aspects of it that are similar. Many of the buttons are symmetrical. Not all the buttons are the same. If I flip the remote over, the back does not look like the front. The color is not the same throughout. If I had another remote control, there is a degree to which the remote demonstrates sameness to another remote, and yet it is similar or dissimilar in other ways. I can have the exact same remote, and in that respect I can say that one remote is the same as another. Now, undoubtedly there are variabilities, small, minute variabilities that I am unable to perceive. And the fact that they are two different objects makes them different, and they are, in fact, not the same. But herein lies a sort of interesting issue, this nested sameness along with difference. So, I hope to be making some sort of sense here. A false balance is not good. So again, I return to the word balance and the difficulties that are associated with what balance might be. I think at the outset, to understand balance, we have to understand the constraints around which we view something as equivalent. For if we take, in the case of the level, what we are comparing for equivalence, the purposes of equivalence is the height of that balance. And if they are perfectly the same height above the surface or the base of the level, then we know that there is an equivalency in weight. Now, this equivalency in weight is one measure by which we come to understand an aspect or a level, a layer of equivalence. A synonym here is, of course, balance. But just like the remote, there are plenty of ways that we can identify both between objects and within one object where there are many dissimilarities. And the question is, well, does the recognition of this nested process of identification matter? And I think it does. I think it does for the very words that are used in this verse. A false balance is not good. If we were unable to identify what a true balance was, then how would we be able to determine what is equivalent? And if we are not able to determine what is equivalent, then in some sense, this extends well beyond the analogy of maintaining one's balance, or in the case of the economic scale, or in the scales of justice, for that matter. If we are unable to determine equivalency, we are unable to determine what something is. And I think that there is more that must be said there. Because why then does the equivalence indicate, at least to the human being, that between two things, that thing in the middle that we say, that we identify as equivalent, how does it establish that relationship? Well, there's an identification, there's attention to important components, to establishing understanding and knowing of something. Their relatedness is dependent upon that equivalence. That, again, at least in the human mind, that draws things together, or from one thing itself, the identity of one thing itself. Its emergence out of the randomness is latched onto by our minds. Some specific pattern is seen. And this pattern, I think, is fundamentally drawn by a series of equivalencies. Without equivalencies, then we have no relationships. Without relationships, we have no statements. We have nothing to identify. We have nothing to declare. It is just things that are floating in nothingness, that don't really correspond to one another. And so, if we are to say at the totality of it all, and we say false balance, let's throw everything into a state of false balance, then nothing would be related to it. Human beings would cease to exist. The very forces that bind us together, the laws by which we follow and are subject to, in the sense that the natural law, the binding of particles together, the organization of atoms and the formation of molecules, and the experience and the life and the pursuits of the various organs and cells within an organism, and then, of course, the higher level organism, all of this would be disjointed, unoriented, and non-existent. Now, of course, in the human sense, we are limited beings. We have limited perception. And by our limited perception, we are susceptible to this false balance, the seeing of false balance, or being deceived by some false balance. This is where the fraudulent comes in. And this is also why I think, at least in part, that the explanation of the fraudulent at the outset was not sufficient to describe the mechanism that was occurring. Because, of course, it's fraudulent for a person that is responsible for producing a standard in the marketplace to find some equivalency. We don't really understand the broader implications of that unless we consider what equivalency means for existence, essentially, for relatedness, for identification. And so if there is a false balance at some level that can be controlled by man, perhaps, or mistaken by man, then he is identifying something that he thinks is, but actually is not. And therefore he is deceived. And if he is deceived, surely we can say that it is not a good thing. Man's goings are of the Lord. How can a man then understand his own way? Okay, so today's a new day. Now with every new day comes a fresh mind, or perhaps a mind that has been carried through the day, perhaps not fresh, but it is ready to begin this journey anew, let's say. And I remembered the last time that I recorded this verse, it had a large amount of meaning that was packed in it. Because at the outset, it's a bit of a strange verse. It's not like some where we kind of get the gist of it, and it might take a little bit to unpack it, but this one's a strange one. Man's goings are of the Lord. How can a man then understand his own way? So this word, goings, is where we shall start. It's a rather strange word. And it's also a rather strange thing to do, to type it into Google to find a definition of it, because it seems like such a simple word. And yet its definition is an act or instance of leaving a place, a departure. the condition of the ground viewed in terms of suitability for walking, riding, or other travel. Another definition, existing or available, to be had. So we have a few different definitions here of the common expression. The question, how are things going? In this context, we see, if we zoom out far enough, that there is a beginning and an end, and then this question is sort of, as the process is unfolding, and in between that beginning and end, how are things going? How are they at the moment? How are they existing? How are they to be had? And again, in the broader sense, the act of departure, going from one place to another. Man's goings are of the Lord. So here again we have that word, Lord, one that is, in my mind, often overlooked because it is something that is assumed to be. It's something that is venerated highly, as it ought to be, but in my case perhaps not thought of enough. So let's, as I talk to myself, let's be selfish for a moment. And I may ask myself, what are your goings? How are things going for you? In the sense of leaving a place, of departing. I suppose at the outset it's difficult to say. There's always some sort of departure happening, whether it be a large scale or a small scale departure or going. Life itself is a bit of a departure from inception. It is this continual going out into life, into existence, into being, into knowing, and into death. We can say of the word go something of a start. Go sometimes is synonymous with begin. There's also an element of departure. Of course, goings is not entirely different than go. Now, but of the meaning of the existence, how are things going? The response to such a question is interesting. It's telling of what we understand the phrase to mean by the response that we give to it. Now, of course, there's all sorts of different responses out there. The more cynical the answer, the short answer, it's going, meaning I'm tolerating my existence at the moment. Please don't bother me. Or it is going well, that there is some goodness to the experience that is being had. There are more sophisticated ways about answering that question. One could go into detail about how they are feeling. And yet it would be an interesting thing to think about, why is it exactly that somebody would go into how they are feeling when one asks them, how are things going? What is it about feelings and the explanation of them that seem to be implied when the question is asked. Of course, it's more than just feelings, but feelings often come up. Feelings are often the arbiters to memory. When somebody says, "How are things going?" perhaps a feeling is the thing that serves to scurry away within the vault of the mind to gather information, whether it's joyful or sorrowful. Whatever is most salient comes up to us. How are things going? If it's a friend of ours, a close friend or a close relative, perhaps we are to think more in depth, or we are to consider something that is more meaningful. And when we consider things that are more meaningful, I think that it is bound to that feeling that when we search all of the variability that we have experienced, all of the information that we have taken in, much of which we don't remember, much of which we don't choose to recall because it's just not important to the question. But what is important to the question, at least in this case when the question actually matters, is something fundamental. It is something that, again, something that means something. Something that grabs one's attention. And it is within the grasping, perhaps that is sort of facilitated through the spirit of the feelings that form this hand, to grab out that cognitive information. How is it going? I may say that I am stressed. And why might you say that you are stressed when I ask, how are things going? Well, because I'm dealing with change. And change, I think, is inherently stressful. There are many things that are piled upon the plate. There are many things to consume and to process and to experience. It's difficult to understand what items I ought to hang on to and what items I ought to give up, or what items I ought to throw away. And why might it be, then, that because of one's uncertainty about the mode of their sacrifice and the orientation of their attention, that causes one to say that one is stressed in response to the question, how are things going? What can we say about this sacrifice? What exactly in our day-to-day lives are we giving up? What is the role of our attention? Within the cultural sphere, I think sometimes it's hard to find spiritual matters. Everything seems to be so diluted and soulless. But of course, it is not. No matter how dim the light might be, the light must be on in order to see. And so even in mundane affairs, or matters that have had something taken out of them that should fundamentally be within, what can we say? What can we say about this sacrifice? What does it mean to give something up, even as simple as one's attention? if I'm focusing on a particular, let's say I'm engaged in a conversation. Perhaps this is a new type of conversation, one that I'm not too familiar with. It's a type of conversation that involves a certain level of responsibility. There are certain things I have to accomplish in this conversation. Out of all of the things that I can ask, surely it's quite simple, easy, to narrow down a degree of orientation, of relatedness, such that the questions aren't wildly out of context. However, even within that sphere, it can be difficult to ask the right questions. In order to ask the right questions, I think we have to visualize ourselves as a being with a flashlight in the heavenly sphere. We are shining the light on various places, a large expanse of possible information. What we choose to linger on is what we find is important. If we fail, we linger on something that is not all that important. Perhaps it is out of fear that we don't know where else to go or where else to shine the light. But if we know that what we are pointing at is not that what we are after, then it should be easy to point the light somewhere else. And so the question is, how do we know what we're after? And I suppose that is at the root of our sacrifice, because it's quite easy to give up those small things for which we point the light at something that is not all that meaningful or purposeful if we understand exactly what it is that we are wishing to shine the light upon. And then the further question is, well, if we cannot see it, then how do we know that it's there? How do we know that we will find it? Is it because that we have seen it before? Is it because we have experienced it before? What does a blind man know of vision? Surely he has a conceptualization of the world beyond his blindness, or at least he has some map given the constraints that he currently has. Man can find himself, I think, in any number of constraints short of death. But that's just the thing. There are many constraints. But he is a living being. And short of his death, no matter how limited he is, he has that map. And that map is what? What territory does it describe? What is this innate thing that we all seem to possess? Well, it is the experience of going, I think, in some sense. It's the experience of existence, of participating in the world, whether some large part or some small. And I suppose that there are a number of different paths that I can go down here. But for the moment, I'll move forward and I'll say that if our goings is to be equivalent to our experiences, and if our experiences are sort of going to be this equation of searching, of sacrificing, of understanding something at some level that we don't quite understand, It's like being attached to an arm or a leg. Perhaps we don't think about it much. I don't think about it much this way, but certainly my hand is not an agent, my foot is not an agent, yet as I see them now, my mind is sort of quite separate from identifying with these appendages. And that's not to say that it truly is a separate thing. I am one thing, one person. And to think exactly how I'm related to my extremities, I suppose I can go down a complex rabbit hole of joints and receptors and of the ability of the appendage to interact in the world, to put forth the will and the purpose of the mind, and also to receive from the environment, to receive the information that either I choose to pay attention to or I choose not to pay attention to. Or I choose to remember it or I choose not to remember it. Now, in both situations, both as my appendage as an extension of my mind and my purposefulness, my will, and at times, if I think about it as separate, it seems this weird, strange, liminal space, and yet, if I'm sort of in that being mode and I'm just sort of participating, if I'm in my life and I am within the experience that I had mentioned, that stressful experience of change, I'm not thinking about my appendages, I'm thinking about the task at hand. I'm trying desperately to grab onto that material, that information in the world that is important for me to remember and retain, such that I can interact in the way that I need to. I can perform my duty as I should. And on the other hand, if I haven't just mentioned it, it is the reception. It is my participation and also the world's participation with me. All of this is a part of my going, my experience. Now, if all of this is to be of, or to be part of, the Lord, then I am within that thing. I am within that experiential realm. The realm, as I've referred to it as the realm of intelligibility. At this point, it has become increasingly less satisfying to refer to it this way. The realm of intelligibility, the realm of understanding, the realm of luminosity where consciousness and will and purposefulness can exist. One has to wonder if there can be a picture without borders. Man's goings are of the Lord. So now I wonder what else there is to be said here about goings, of this experience. Of my limited ability to see and attend to things that are optimally purposeful for a given task. And then for the task, is that task itself optimal at another layer? It may be immediately optimal, but is it optimal within the institution? Is it optimal within the culture? Is the culture optimal within what? Is the institution optimal within what? The culture, the state? between them, the institution, and the individual? What is it exactly? Can there be an image without borders? Can it just continue indefinitely? Or perhaps it is just this experience of relatedness and expansion. It would be quite a strange thing if the experience of man was sort of like a Truman Show for the divinity, just to see exactly what he would do. But just as my hand is the goings of me, I think man is sort of the appendage of God, that he is the goings of him, to whatever small degree. Perhaps it's not as large as an appendage. Perhaps it is as small as a cell, or as a piece of DNA. Man's goings are of the Lord. How can a man then understand his own way? And now this is interesting. It's as if the cell has gained itself a degree of consciousness. And perhaps it is against humility here to say that a cell does not have consciousness. Certainly it doesn't have it at the level that the human being does, but relative to the levels beneath it, surely it has that level and layer of sophistication such that it has a greater degree of freedom, a greater degree of will, that it is able to move around constrained, certainly as though it is, certain actions and mechanisms, and so are we constrained by certain actions and mechanisms and responsibilities, just at a different layer, a different level of complexity. And if we are to be sort of the cell of a divinity, a cell of a higher intelligence, for which our interaction is important to its going, to its own experience, then it is an interesting question. How can man then understand his own way? Because his way is in some sense the way of the higher consciousness. The way of the cell in my body. It has no choice in the matter where it goes. Perhaps it has a choice in the matter locally where it goes, how it interacts, exactly how it fights off a pathogen maybe. Or it's the regulation of the cellular proteins on its wall. And so the question is, just as much for the cell as it is for me, how do we understand our own way if we are all a part of something greater? Now, I don't want to fall into a sort of pantheism here, but this verse is pointing at, I think, a degree of interrelatedness of things that one might expect to see in pantheism. The only difference here is that it's pointing all the way to the top. It is not just everything existing together, perhaps, which it is, but not for no purpose. That again, above us is that next level, that next layer of consciousness. That it is possible, at least, for us to conceive that this next layer of experience exists. And I think it stands to reason that we can go all the way. If it is not infinite, then we can find a ceiling. And perhaps the ceiling is in motion, much like the tip of a spear that's thrown. But it's too difficult to say. Too many variables. We don't need to necessarily go there to understand this verse. But regardless of all of that, man's way is within certain constraints. It is at the level that he is at. Fallen in the sense that he is below the highest. But redeemable in the sense that he has a degree of agency given his position in that space, that hierarchy. It is a snare to the man who devours that which is holy, and after vows to make inquiry. So fundamental to understanding this verse is the understanding and exploration of what it means. First of all, the word holy, what it means, and then secondly, what it means to devour that, or to consume that. And it's devour in a way that seems to imply destruction. Or to use it for purposes that are against its design. So a quick definition of the word holy: dedicated or consecrated to God or a religious purpose, sacred. So these words, sacred and consecrated, again, they are not, it seems as though we don't have the foundation. From this I get some sense of importance. I get an idea that it is foundational. It is a sturdy thing. It is perhaps an apparatus or a person that has strong roots of that which is consecrated. It is to make or to declare something sacred. So again, we see the word sacred. Dedicate formally to a religious or divine purpose. Again, this is not really helping us explain holy. Now there's an informal definition that says to devote something exclusively to a particular purpose. Now, this particular purpose, of course, is a sacred purpose. It is a foundational purpose. But we have yet really to identify that foundation. And so what could be said of this word sacred? Now, the word sacred means connected with God or the gods, or dedicated to a religious purpose, and so deserving veneration. Sacred is religious rather than that of the secular, regarded with great respect and reverence by a particular religion group or individual. So, within the sacred, we have a connection. We have a connection to God. We have a connection to the divine. So far, this word holy, what I'm getting, that of the consecrated, it is a dedication. It is an orientation of attention to something. It is the establishment, I could say perhaps it's the establishment of attention or some act or ritual towards something. Now it's towards the divine, towards God, but once we see the word sacred, then this expands it out a little bit more, because now it is connected with God, it's dedicated again to that specific purpose, such that it deserves veneration. And so the question then is, well, what deserves veneration? Veneration being great respect or reverence. Okay, so the image I have in my mind is the eye or AI that is giving its attention towards the highest. Now I imagine a pillar, okay, maybe like an ancient Greek column, in which the top of that column is the thing that we revere the most. It is the thing that we venerate. The question is, well, what exactly is that thing? Now we could place God at the top of that. We can place any number of things at the top of that. But what we orient our attention towards is going to be the thing that we worship. So, of veneration, great respect or reverence. Now we have to go into what respect and reverence are. So, starting with respect. A feeling, okay, so that's interesting, of deep admiration for someone or something elicited by their abilities, qualities, or achievements. The state of being admired or respected. Due regard for the feelings, wishes, rights, or traditions of others. A particular aspect, point, or detail. Now that first and third definition, the feeling of deep admiration for someone or something elicited by their abilities, qualities, or achievements, and then a particular aspect, point, or detail, they're fairly similar. That in the first, we are identifying a connection of the heart to that of an aspect or a form. Now, admiration, I think, is quite an interesting word, for it means itself respect or warm approval. Now, we can't have a definition of respect include a word that itself means respect. We'll find ourselves in a cycle of meaninglessness. So what we have to do is find the principle around which that meaning articulates. So the etymology of this word respect, I think it's fundamental to understanding this verse, or at least to the word holy. Now, we found ourselves in a bit of a rabbit hole here, which is a good thing. This will allow us, I think, to plant the seed quite deep for it to grow later on. So from the Proto-Indo-European, the prefix re or re means back, and specere, S-P-E-C-E-R-E, means to see. So what we have here is a meaning of looking back. Of this meaning, to look back, I think of that which is somebody is paying attention to something. To turn and to look back is to have regard or pay attention to something. Perhaps it means to acknowledge something when one turns back. From Latin, we have respectus, which again means look back at, regard, or consider. From the Middle English, respect, which is regard or consideration. We have the Old French, respect, same spelling. It retained that meaning of to look back, but it was broadened to encompass the mental act of paying attention, valuing or considering something or someone. So we have, at the fundament, at the principle, we have attention, which is interesting. We have attention. We have the recognition of something that is valuable because of that attention, that looking back, and consideration that there is something within the thing that they are attending to that is actually worth the attention in the first place. So, how do we draw a conclusion from all of this? Keeping in mind that we started from the word holy. We started from the word holy, dedicated, which it means to, for something to be sacred, consecrated. We went to both the word sacred and consecrated, and we found a connection between God and purposefulness. We found a connection between an act and the veneration, the recognition perhaps of some divinity, or of something that is above himself, or something that is worthwhile to pay attention to. Now within this veneration, we see the word respect and reverence. Within reverence and respect, we have that orientation of attention towards something that is worthwhile to pay attention to. Now, there are plenty of things that are seemingly perceived as worthwhile to pay attention to, and yet would not be considered holy or sacred. And in addition to that, I think we have to understand that there is a degree of variability for which people can consecrate or venerate something. There are plenty of individuals out there, perhaps groups of individuals, that have established religions and institutions that are set up to house sacred material that to others would seem strange. Man, as he is unable to see the totality of it all. He can see pieces at a time. He finds himself within this web of perceived relativism, and yet his experience points him, and his existence points him towards that centerpiece, the piece that is upon the mantle, the axis of rotation, or the axis around which things rotate. And I think part of the thing here that we are dealing with in the word holy is the axis around which that which is truly valuable rotates. Or perhaps the attention, the axis around which that attention rotates, the attention towards that thing that is truly valuable. Now, admiration, I think, is an important piece to this puzzle, because I had mentioned that we have this attention. The attention, it forms a bond, like in my mind I think of a chemical bond between different molecules. Once this bond is formed, we have the ability to remember that which we are paying attention to because we find it valuable. I think there's an interesting conversation about how it is that one finds something valuable, or how something becomes to be sacred. And surely, not everybody that sees a particular thing will recognize its sacredness unless certain things are brought into awareness. And so being caught within the aspectual may limit an individual from seeing the broader picture of why it's considered sacred, of why it should be respected, why it should be paid attention to, and honestly paid attention to. On the other hand, it is not a denial of the aspects, because the aspects are fundamental to grab one's attention. Because usually when we see something, we see but an aspect, and it is only by perception and addition within the mind that we perceive the whole. For instance, I have the Bible in front of me here as a physical object, or even of the verses that are on the page. My attention is such that I can see the words, and perhaps even when I'm talking, I can focus on a couple of the words. I can see the letters. I see. If I explained it, if I read them verbatim, it would defeat the purpose. But the point is that I can pay attention to its aspects. I can pay attention to its aspects to a quite sophisticated degree. But my attention is limited, and in this instance, I'm looking at the Bible. I'm looking at many different verses. But because my attention is devoted to the microphone, it is devoted to explaining the verse that I've just read, all the other verses are unable to occupy that landscape, the fertile field in which it can grow, that hidden potential can actually grow. But what does that mean? What is that hidden potential? Well, it's difficult to say exactly, perhaps, but the process that is unfolding now, that is the process of discovery and understanding, I think is to a degree that potential. And it's not just the potential that can be enacted into the world. I mean, it must be that to a degree, but this is sort of close to the perceptual, or to the information accepting or information gathering organelle, meaning that the type of play that is occurring here, the type of understanding that is occurring here, is not that of the mechanical in the physical sense, in the physical world. It is that of the perceptual in order to lead to some understanding in the physical world. It is a precursor of knowledge, perhaps. And as long as I pay attention to that thing which is on my mind, which is talking about this word holy, what comes to be is a greater understanding of that thing. It is just obvious that that devotion of attention, the sacrifice of that which otherwise would pervert that attention, like paying attention to too many aspects of something that don't necessarily apply or are too minimal to the understanding of the true value, perhaps. So, for example, there's a lot can be done, I think, of examining an aspect. I think the Proverbs are a good proof of that, because on the surface, it's not immediately apparent that one can dive quite deeply and unpack quite a lot of things. And I suppose from an aspectual standpoint, on one hand, the verses, although they are tiny aspects, they reveal quite a bit, and it's important to pay attention to them. On the other hand, if I look down at the corner of the page and I see that I'm on page 725, this not only would distract me from the aspect that is prompting me towards a type of understanding, but also perhaps there is a way to examine that aspect such that it is something valuable comes from it. But likely not. And so what I mean to say here is that there is an orientation of the aspects of something that actually is a hierarchy. One is more important to pay attention to than the other. Now, if we are to consider the whole, there is no possible way, if I was going to consider the whole of the Bible in terms of its grammar, language, and meaning, I could to some degree determine the whole in a material sense. I can close the book and get a good feeling, a good sense of it. My hand would be feeling the binding in the back of it. My eyes would be seeing the front of the book, perhaps. Even then, I wouldn't have the entirety of the aspect, but it would entirety of the whole, rather, which is the making up of its aspects. I would have enough information to give me a map of the whole that thing is. And there's an interesting relationship between the aspect and the whole. There's an interesting relationship between one aspect and another aspect. But the question really is, how do you order those aspects? How do you order them such that you can attend to something long enough for something purposeful and meaningful to be done in the world? How, then, is one to determine what is actually purposeful or actually meaningful? And I think that same process must be undertaken for that pursuit as well. It is by examining that whole or that form, if value was a Bible and it was in front of me, which it seems like it is a form of value and purpose that is wound up in language, in written word, and it has a material form. But what it is, it's much larger than just one of its aspects. It is much more than just a material thing, but it is also more than just words and sentences and I would say even poetic mastery. It has its material form. It goes in these, both ways. Perhaps what is most meaningful to us is the information that is captured within its words, certainly. And so that's what we pay attention to when we open the book. We don't just pay attention to the paper or to the cover, which we might, but that's something that's below that which is higher, which is the meaning that are within the words and sentences. And so now we have some understanding of the direction of attention, that it ought to be oriented towards something so that we can, number one, determine how to understand something. Number two, I think it has to do with action in the world, or purposeful action, perhaps. It is finding out exactly what that purpose is, what the reason for it is. And the purposefulness, I think, becomes more and more interesting once we have satisfied the requirements, the basic requirements, that of satisfying thirst and hunger and shelter. Perhaps even in the pursuit of those things, we are considering what is higher, what the point of us doing that is. For certainly there have been people in the past that have thought the question, despite one's miserable suffering, is their suffering actually worth existence? And if you ask that question, is my suffering worth existence? Then one must ask, well, what is the worth of existence? Because surely one knows their worth of suffering because they experience it. They have all the information at hand. They can feel their hunger. Their heart is steeped in that desperation. But the value of their existence, that's a more difficult question to answer. But like many things in life, and I think ideally, if a person is going to mature throughout life, they'll find and they'll understand better ways for which they can spend their money. Perhaps when they're young, they spend it frivolously on things that satisfy the basic pleasures. Sometimes adults do this as well. But invariably, I think, as we get older, we save money for retirement. We save for the future because we know that we'll need something. So in a certain sense, that basic necessity becomes more important. We're more aware of it. We're aware that our action in the world will decrease as we move into old age and frailty. And along with that, I think we have to come to some understanding of the condition of life, the value of life given the basics. As we get older and death approaches, again, we are faced with the existential, not as though we are not faced with it before, but perhaps more acutely, we are prompted to reckon with it, to recognize it, respect it. And now I've yet to describe or to explain what of this experience, what of this reflection, what of this respect is actually being unfolded. Because in there is the holy. It is coming to some understanding, or the orientation of one's understanding of the value and the worth of their life, of how they should spend their days, of what they should be paying attention to, of what they should be spending their money on. Now, what I've at least attempted to point to, that as life continues and as we age, respect and orientation of attention probably changes fundamentally as one moves out of their teen years into a degree, a level of independence. And here I go back to the heart. This thing that could be ever so deceiving and yet so fundamental to our experience and our existence, the desires and the feelings that we have. I think the same analogy can be used from earlier in life and the spending of money on frivolous things to that later in life to the more discerning approach to spending money. We can approach that, I think, in terms of the expression of feeling. That when one is younger, one is quick to emotion, one is quick to the basic emotions, to anger, to lust, perhaps. And this undiscerningness is abated with age. When the discerning emotions come, they are more sophisticated. They are loftier emotions. They value. They are born of different values. And usually, at least what I've experienced in my life, is that these values are in part a reorganization of attention, such that one now looks at their relationships, for example, in a different way, that it is not a relationship of necessity. It is not a relationship of satisfaction, of base satisfaction. It is reciprocal, but it is reciprocal, and it is also approached from the place of love. What does that mean? What does love mean? Love is something itself can expand from youth to old age. It is a coming into a greater understanding of, and that greater understanding influences our behavior. It influences how we interact with one another. It influences how we go about trying to expand that relationship, trying to make it more full, trying to strengthen the bond. And so part of what I'm struggling with here is coming to some understanding of a word that requires experience, it requires interaction. It requires feeling. It requires nurturing. But perhaps just like a tree that grows from a seed, it is something that comes to be over time. When it comes to be strong, one has to ask the question, well, what does it mean for that tree to be strong? It reaches an age of maturity, that which is marked by its size, by the way it appears, by its character, by its aspect. And it should be regarded in that way. It should be respected in that way because of what it has achieved. And the time that it is spent growing and achieving. Now, I'm going to do something that I hate doing, or I strongly dislike doing, and that is to leave in the middle of a thought. And I will continue this tomorrow evening. And it will be interesting to me because I'll have a day's worth of experience, a good 9 to 10 hours of work, and yet to this recording, it'll pick up immediately after I press pause. And so it is my hope that when I continue this next time, that my discussion of the word holy has some continuity to it, and that I'm able to integrate that back into the broader verse. It is a snare to the man who devours that which is holy, and after vows to make inquiry. And after I finish this verse, I'm probably going to end the episode and continue with the last part, which will be the remaining 4 verses, or 5 verses. So until tomorrow. So surprise, surprise, it is the next day. And this is going to be difficult to start this engine up again. But here we go. I finished talking about the holy. I come to some understanding that the holy involves a relationship. It involves an orientation of attention towards something. On the vertical axis, it is aiming towards the highest point. On that vertical axis, towards the center, or towards the more inferior, lower down on that axis, are things of lesser and lesser value. Things higher up on that axis are things of higher and higher value. The way in which one comes to determine what is valuable and how they are related to that sort of thing is a difficult matter. In part because the human being does not have the absolute understanding. He doesn't know exactly what's at the top of the pillar. But just because he doesn't know doesn't mean that there isn't something at the top of the pillar. He is always working, if he is an honest person, a humble person, to perfect himself and to try and do good. So his aim is towards the good, although he may make a mistake. And I think that despite his ignorance, despite his level of consciousness that limits him from the absolute, he can by various measures determine what is right or what is good. And the question is, well, what are those various measures, and how does this fit into this word holy? Now again, to return to the word respect, which is fundamental to the word holy. If we are to consecrate something, to make something holy, we are raising it up. What we are raising up is the thing that we respect. It is that place which we direct our attention. So again, in some respect, the word respect implies turning and orienting in such a way that we observe various relationships between things. Now, this word within the holy is related to admiration, because within that word respect, what we have is admiration. It is the introduction of the heart to something that is an otherwise, or at least so far, a rational process, which is sort of a disinterested thing. It's not very actionable, perhaps, in the world. I mean, we can observe, but it is not as though we are observing disinterested. We have to also be a part of that world, which involves the heart, which involves that the seat of the feelings and desires, which is that, again, the heart. Now, admiration, which I have discussed, is this opening of wonder. It is an explosion of a certain type of sense, a sense of belonging, a sense of purposefulness, a sense of connectedness. And there is this sense because one understands the landscape of things that are connected to one another. And when one feels as though they are viewing a map of disintegration, or that they don't understand the place that they're in, they don't have an accurate map of understanding of relationships, then I think that this connectedness, the feeling, the sense of connectedness, and that purposefulness goes by the wayside. And if there is no clear direction or orientation, then one is lost. And to be lost within the conscious sphere means anxiety, it means depression, it means difficulty understanding one's place in life, in reality. Their existence has become difficult. It has become certainly troubled. I'm thinking of an analogy of friction. The coefficient of friction is much larger. It doesn't slide. It's not harmonious. And so I think here that within the appreciation of the observation of the things that are related and the integration of the heart into that experience, as a verb, the word wonder means a desire to be curious, to know something. So falling in love with the desire to know, or that process of knowing. As a noun, the wonder is described as a feeling of surprise mingled with admiration, again that word admiration, caused by something beautiful, unexpected, unfamiliar, or inexplicable. And the question is, well, is the thing that we have to rely on, must it be always inexplicable? Our very desire for understanding and curiosity, that thing that sort of satiates us once we identify something, or perhaps we identify and participate, that we have some stake, some personal involvement in it. Is it grounded within that inexplicableness, in that infinite? And it is, I suppose, possible. But the constraints that are placed upon that thing for which man can only begin to understand, the constraints that are placed on it by his mind, I think necessarily reveal to him something that is tangible, something that is to be had, something that can ultimately satisfy him. And it is possible for him to find himself in a state of observation and outside of that realm of participation. When he finds himself there, perhaps he will find himself in a state of perpetual longing. And yet when he finds himself included in the experience of the search, that it is his body and his being that is absorbed into that web of relationships, rather than just basic, superficial relationships. He is interacting with other human beings. He is exchanging information in ways that are meaningful and impactful. I think a man can find himself in an unfortunate position in which he is always hungry, like a drug addict, for more out of life and more out of reality, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But if man can never find himself completely content or in a state of harmony, if he can never let go of that desire for more, I think he will be caught in a spiral of unfortunate melancholy, and this bizarre addiction to the intelligible sphere. Now again, I make no argument against the drive towards dedication and striving and achievement in life. That is not the point, it's not the purpose. But it is to say, if that is all there is, then it's inherently going to be limiting on one's experience. One's experience is not going to be full. It is going to be as though they are wishing and desiring to witness the whole so that they can sort of fade into a state of contentment, so that they can take that fentanyl hit and just sort of be content forever, this bliss. Now, I've seen it now that I could just sort of relax and just coast the rest of my existence until my mind goes dark. That sort of wanting, I think, will lead, like I said, a man into this desperate state, like Gollum. He's sort of subject to something that constantly takes from him and never gives back to him. And this type of God, I think, certainly is a cruel God, but it's better to develop a relationship with one that understands and returns that there can actually be a relationship with that thing. And I think that this thing that can give back and can actually reciprocate is on a higher level or a higher plane than that God which is only able to ask. And what is given, perhaps, if anything is to be given, is enough to keep him. But herein lies the issue, because the same could be said of both gods. that man will continue to strive as long as he has some reinforcement to his striving. If there were completely no fruits to my striving here reading these verses, I don't think that I would participate in this. And because of my striving, I gain some sort of a holistic feeling. I feel connected and accomplished after I've explored my thoughts and am guided by the wisdom of the ages. But of course it's but an aspect of my life, and there are more things in my life that I do to stay connected. Not as much as I should, surely. And I think part of this process is revealing to me that fact that there are things that perhaps ought to be done to create a better environment so that the more difficult days don't disrupt my way of life or my soul, such that it is disturbed and unable to, I don't want to use the word satisfied again, unable to be. And not just unable to be as a medicated slave, but able to be as an independent agent that is confident and connected, that is plugged in to the world, plugged into the righteous world. Okay, so we have hopefully discovered an aspect, maybe a map for the holy. It is a snare to the man who devours that which is holy. So a snare is something that, a trap, it is something that somebody can get caught in. And what exactly does it mean to be caught in the context of the holy, in the context of, in the attempt to devour that which is holy? That's another interesting thing. Perhaps we should start there. What does it mean exactly to devour the holy? If one is to devour something, they are to consume it, but to consume it in such a way that implies destruction. If we could say that a meal is devoured, it's a bit different when we say that a city is devoured, almost as if a spirit has risen up and come crashing down on that society. We could say that within our minds we can have our selves be devoured by an unfortunate relationship with a partner that perhaps takes advantage of our longing. In broader terms, I think we can think of the word devour as to consume, to engulf, sort of to encapsulate something. Now we're talking about a specific person that does this, that envelops. And through their envelopment, much like the food that is within the mouth that is to be destroyed, it is to be broken up. For a single person, I think this can have physical manifestations as well as purely conscious manifestations. If one is to devour the holy, they are to take in that which is highest and attempt to lower it on that vertical scale of value. But it's more than just that. They wish to blot it out. to engulf it in the realm of the mind, perhaps for selfish purposes, so that they can have it for themselves. That holiness, just like I was describing, the aspect of the man that has this strange relationship to God, such that he is given just enough, like a drug dealer justifying his occupation, selling drugs to the community, saying that, well, everybody has to eat, and it's their choice to accept what I'm offering. There is no personal accountability in terms of what they're attempting to do. If one is to destroy the holy, the consecrated, they would destroy the respect. They destroy the orientation of attention and the participation in that orientation of attention to that which is wonderful and beautiful. When they destroy that wonder, the beauty, and the conception of good that has at least some standing in society, no matter how faulty it is. At times I think of institutions, various institutions, and I say something to the effect of, I dislike the institution, I wish it was just completely different. And yet there's a voice in my head that says, well, the institution is not perfect, but at least there is one, because its existence is fundamental. In a like manner, I think our conception of what is beautiful and what is good, although it may be difficult at times to come to the proper relationship to it, or to justify, given certain experiences in life, the only choice that we have, if we want to live somewhat peacefully, somewhat in harmony with the reality and existence that we find ourselves in, then we have to accept certain conceptions. And we could do our best to understand better, but without accepting the process by which one undergoes understanding goodness, then we are destroying the very thing by which man can find himself at peace in the world at all. He will be this perpetual, anxiety-filled, guilt-ridden being. And that is the God that he worships, because that is what he is given in return for his attention. His attention being this thing that is fragmented, disoriented, not all understanding of what should be attended to, for what purpose and for what reason. And so a man is caught because he will not be at peace. His being and his existence will be this anxiety-filled nightmare. So it is a snare to the man who devours that which is holy, and after vows to make enquiry. So what is meant by the word enquiry? Enquiry is an act of asking for information. It's a question. It's an investigation, exploration, examination. And so surely when one experiences this snare, they will have questions. If they had committed it in complete ignorance, I would imagine that this would cause some existential suffering. For once they have found themselves caught in this snare, they begin to realize and understand where their mistakes have been, or at least they understand that there is a mistake. I've certainly had these experiences in my life, and they're quite painful to go through, but also quite enlightening. I'm not exactly sure what to make of that the second half of that verse. Not sure if it's a positive thing or a negative thing. Perhaps it's a bit of both. It's a snare to a man who devours that which is holy, and after vows to make inquiry. Does this mean to imply that even the vow to make inquiry after is part of the snare that he finds himself in? Surely it would be appropriate to investigate what the cause was for one falling into a trap. But perhaps it would not be appropriate to investigate it such that they would not fall into the trap again for the sake of falling into the trap. Now, I'm not sure if this is quite right, because I think the trap has a good place. The snare has a good place. It occupies a potential place of teaching. That if one is to make a mistake, then the consequence ought to be the thing that reorients the individual. But it certainly would not be the case. I would suspect that if man has fragmented himself by devouring that which is holy, or had some crisis of faith, or had undergone some fundamental reorganization of what is considered holy, because surely even if one devours that which is holy, that is announced to them, such that the holy that is, or that can be, remains and exists despite man's failure. And it's the only way that reorientation is possible is if man recognizes a mistake, and that something that is true then captures his attention. But the inquiry is a strange one, and the place that the person makes the inquiry is even stranger. Because let's assume for a moment a landscape in which a man, in which ourselves, has devoured the holy. Part of this must be culturally based. Again, here I hear Herodotus saying that custom is the king of all men. Whether it is on point or not, this again gets back to my illustration of the institution. The institutions are fundamental to man and his civilization, regardless whether or not they're perfect. So we have this contentious element of imperfection in us. But to truly devour that which is holy, I think most people have at least some conception of at least an aspect of the holy. They have some limits and some boundaries. Most people are not completely psychopathic or completely pathological in that sense. Now, if one is to commit such a sin that the holy has been disintegrated or obliterated, and yet they have the self-awareness in the mind to see above it and to drop a light of refuge down into the darkness, what then would they see? What then would be the recovery of their fragmentation? Is it possible to restore that fragmentation? For in that situation, it may not be as simple as, well, maybe it is as simple as returning to respect, to proper respect. And that certainly we have yet to get to this point, but redemption and salvation is not beyond the experience of man. So I have to wonder. And I see that there's a comma after the word holy, and then it begins, and after vows to make inquiry. I think this inquiry is important. An investigation can lead to reorientation and respect. Perhaps it could also lead to misdiagnosis and further self-deception. It's difficult to say exactly. But in either case, I think I'm going to end this episode here and continue next time with verse 26.